main priority as a bureau is going to be domestic terrorism.
Really paints anybody who's right of center.
If you're a pro-life, pro-family Catholic, they define you as radical.
These are anti-government.
We have freedom of religion and freedom of speech.
Violent extremists, and they must be dealt with.
I'm very sorry that this movie even has to be made. I'm very sorry that this movie even could be made in the United States today. But my friend Dinesh D'Souza has made it because the political situation that we're all living in has degraded to the point that it is necessary. That would be the movie Police State. You can go to policestatefilm.net to get your tickets. Whether you want to go see it in theaters, whether you want the virtual premiere, that's where you go. policestatefilm.net. Dinesh, thanks for coming on.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you had made this movie 10 years ago, 15 years ago, certainly, I would have said, Dinesh, you are being hyperbolic. You're a catastrophist. This is insane. Give me a break. And now you make the movie and I think, oh man, I wish you'd made it 2 years ago because the situation seems to be getting worse by the day.
I mean, I'm an immigrant. I'm an enthusiast about America. I'm psychologically, very much of an optimist by temperament. I've experienced the American dream. I've been thrilled to live in a country where we have basic rights enumerated, most of them in the Bill of Rights, that are not subject to political negotiation. 90% of people don't have the ability to cancel out your free speech right or my right to conscience. And the founders were wise enough to put these rights, to make them inviolable, to put them outside the bounds of political trampling. And yet, here we are, and all of this has happened, just as you say, incredibly rapidly. There might have been some germs in Obama, and I think the roots of the police state go into the aftermath of 9/11, but nevertheless, the escalation in the last couple of years is just dizzying, so that suddenly, if you just go down the Bill of Rights and list them, it's hard to think of a single right that is completely safe.
The clearest example of this in recent memory for me was when I saw that FBI memo about the spying on Catholic churches, traditionalist, extreme, radical Catholic churches, or whatever nonsense they called it. And the FBI, once this memo leaked, immediately disavowed, and they said, oh, it was an accident. It was one field office. No, I don't know how this got out there, but we had nothing to do with it. And then we found out even that testimony was a lie, that this spying was going on in multiple field offices. There were multiple memoranda about it. And you thought, well, okay, now I can't even trust that you're going to do due diligence on this spying on Americans, calling parents domestic extremists. Meanwhile, when actual domestic extremists, terrorists like Antifa, commit crimes, they get completely let off the hook. So how did we get here?
Well, in some ways, there's some people who would point to things like Waco and Ruby Ridge. And I think that there are important insights to be gained from those incidents going back to the 1990s. Just to give one example, I was listening to an interview with the guy, the FBI sniper, who was brought in to Waco after the negotiations broke down. Because they were asking that guy, did you know who David Koresh was? And he goes, no. They go, did you know what you were up against? He goes, no. He goes, my job is operational. I'm basically a killer. And they point out and say, that's a bad guy. You shoot him. And it gave me a little insight into the way that police states work because they operationalize their tasks. So you have an FBI agent or an agent with the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. He's a normal guy. He's got a family. He lives in a 3-bedroom house. And he's thinking about things in terms of, I need a promotion. I want to be seen as a guy who's on the inside, who's doing the important stuff that the FBI cares about. This is how I can retire with a pension. And so they define their tasks that way. And so suddenly you have a guy who's basically a good guy, and yet he's storming into an apartment at 6 a.m. He's grabbing a 70-year-old grandmother. He's pulling her by the hair. He's twisting her arms behind her back, putting handcuffs on her, dragging her down the stairs if she screams or resists. Her neighbors come out and start gawking at her. So this monstrous behavior is being done not by bad people, but by good people who have been incentivized in a bad way.
I remember after January 6th, the worst insurrection ever in the history of any republic, I was at a cigar bar in Washington, D.C., and there were a couple of U.S. Marshals there. and struck up a conversation, just having cigars and drinks, very casual. And I said, "So, how's your job been lately?" And they said, "Oh, it's awful. We got to go arrest these January 6thers who are usually perfectly nice, normal people. There were some Midwestern grannies in the group. There were some just otherwise nice young people." And he said, "It's awful because we got to go and arrest them. And they're very nice. And I think it's wrong. But, hey, that's my job. My job isn't to decide who we go arrest. My job is to go actually carry it out." And you can just begin to see how evil government policies can remain in place for a very long time.
Absolutely. The other thing about our police state, and I think this is what makes the ordinary American especially naive about it, is that the ordinary American has had no real experience of police states, right? America is a country defined by innocence. You can go right back to Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn. It's like, oh, shucks, slavery, really? So you've got this kind of goofball innocence, and it defines the country to a degree. And so when Americans think of police state, they're like looking for a Stalin overcoat, a Hitler mustache. They're looking for a police state in those accents. But our police state is coming stealthily upon us, and it's marching behind the banner of law and democracy and fighting for truth against misinformation and disinformation. And so it's a police state in disguise. Now, the point I want to make is when a police state is fully established, it doesn't need a disguise. When Stalin's goons come to arrest you, you're on a list. They don't have to explain to you why they're getting you. They just hit you over the head. Come with me. But when a police state is in the making, under construction, as I call it, it needs facade. It needs deceit. And so our police state is always providing rationalizations and explanations. Oh, yeah, we're doing the censorship, but, it's only because of January 6th. Or you can't go to church, but that's because of COVID. So one pretext after another, but all in the same direction towards subtracting one upon another of our basic rights.
Right. The rationalizations don't make a lot of sense, especially when they prattle on about democracy, because they will say that if the people elect Donald Trump, as they did in 2016, at least in 2016, that would be a threat to democracy. If the Hungarians elect Viktor Orban, that's a threat to democracy. If the Italians elect Giorgia Meloni, it's a threat to democracy. You say, hold on. How can the majority of people voting for something, how could that possibly be a threat of democracy? That is the definition of democracy. But when the left uses those terms, they conflate democracy with liberalism or democracy with progressivism. And so the terms get so confused.
Well, that, and also, I started out by thinking to myself, do I have to make the case in this movie? Are we becoming a police state? And then I realized that every time I encounter someone who's on the left, they agree that America's becoming a police state, but they think that Trump and you and I are doing it. They think that we are the instruments of the police state. And so we addressed this in the movie. I restructured the debate a little bit about who's right. Is the police state threat coming from the left or is it coming from the right? Now, if you look at Trump, for example, it is amazing that this guy was not running the police agencies of government even in his own administration, right? And so he's certainly not running them now. In fact, I say in the movie, I think I use the line, he's not running the police agencies, he's running away from them. So once you realize that, you begin to ask who is in fact in control of our police state. But there's a little bit of a wrinkle here, which I think is worth mentioning. In normal police states, there's usually a dictator who is manifestly in charge, right? There's Castro, or there's Pol Pot, or Stalin. Right now, the police state of China is being run by Xi. If you consider Russia a police state, it's kind of a quasi-police state, Putin. Okay. Who's running our police state? I mean, our police state has a slightly opaque quality in that Biden is in the canoe. He's, I think, a willing, sailor, if you will, but I don't think he is moving the oars. And so you have a cabal that is evidently running this country, but with Biden as their kind of a willing figurehead.
So then, if we can't quite figure out who it is that is running these things, and I agree, but if I found out that there were marionette strings attached to Joe Biden's arms holding him up at this point, I wouldn't be surprised. Yes, obviously other people are maneuvering power, but if we can't figure out exactly who they are, how do we stop them?
Well, we have to stop them institutionally. This is not just something where a lot of times people say to me, well, Dinesh, what can I do? And there are things you can do, become an election observer, become an election judge, participate to the degree you can in the process. But ultimately, police states are blocked by courts. They're blocked by legislatures, in this case, the Republican House using its full power. They're blocked by secretaries of state and governors and attorneys general. The problem here, I think, is not that we don't have the institutional power. It is true that we are outgunned and outmaneuvered in the cultural debate. The left dominates the big megaphones, the big institutions. But the real problem, I think, is that Republican psychology is very different than the psychology of the left. And so if the left goes gangster on us, we say things like, well, we're not going to go gangster on them because we are too good for that. We stand on principle. We are better than they are. Now, look, there are circumstances where you can say that. I think of Jimmy Stewart in the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where if you're living in a nice small town with a sheriff and so on, you can be like, I'm going to be a law and order guy. And if someone tries to break into my house, I'm going to call the cops. But if you go out west in a covered wagon and you have outlaws with long guns encircling your ranch and they want to burn your homestead and rape your wife and kill your kids, and you say, I'm not going to go get my long gun because I'm better than they are. I'm a law and order man. I'm a man of principle. Something's wrong with you because you have no grasp of the situation that you find here. So when I think about this film, it's kind of a warning. I liken myself to sort of an animal that's detected a movement in the trees, and I'm trying to warn the other wildebeests or the antelopes that, look, don't graze in this kind of placid bovine way because we are all in danger. We need to take some protective action.
Placid bovine way, I think, might be the most apt description of a large part of the American populace that doesn't want to acknowledge the threats that really do exist. This has been a difficult issue for me, speaking of law and order, which is that as a conservative, I've long felt that the support for law and order and the law enforcement agencies is a core aspect of what it means to be an American conservative. And yet, increasingly, I see the American law enforcement agencies being turned against me, and not just against me, but against things that are good and true and beautiful and worth preserving. And those very same law enforcement agencies let Antifa off the hook. They let BLM off the hook. They let illegal immigration off the hook. They ignore the crimes and they punish the people who are trying to preserve the American way of life. So in those circumstances, how are conservatives supposed to think about the police?
Well, we've got to distinguish between a law and order that is anchored in a legitimate system of government and of justice and police state so-called law and order. Police state law and order is always a desecration of true law and order. In fact, it doesn't even do it justice to talk about a double standard, because if we say, and we're so good at pointing out these double standards, hey, look, they're going after Trump. They never went after Biden. In fact, they're covering for Biden. They went after the January 6 guys, but they don't go after Antifa. They don't go after BLM. Well, the problem with this is that this is itself naive, because this assumes that police states are very rigorous about trying to establish equal justice, and so you've caught them out in an inconsistency. Hey, listen, there's a contradiction. Whereas really, police states don't think like that. They have a single standard. Their single standard is we protect the people who are helping to build the police state, and we ruthlessly go after the people who are a threat to the police state. And that is the consistent way in which they operate. So police states should be expected to protect their own. And usually people who are on the side of the police state know that. Even when, Jamal Bowman pulled that fire alarm, I'm sure that not for 1 minute was he afraid that he was going to be put into handcuffs for doing that.
Of course. It reminds me of the observation by the political philosopher Carl Schmitt, who knew a thing or two about police states himself, who said that the fundamental distinction in politics is between friend and enemy. And if you're Jamal Bowman and you pretend like you can't read a sign or you don't know what a fire alarm is, but of course, why was he empowered to do that? Because he knew that he was a friend of the liberal ruling elite, and there was absolutely no risk that he would ever face any consequences, even though what he did constituted more of an insurrection. What he did constituted more of an obstruction of an official congressional proceeding than anything the Horn Hat guy ever did on January 6th.
Absolutely. And the January 6th thing, when you look up close at it, is very, very troubling, because I think it has created, it's not the only case of political prisoners in the United States, but I think it is the most egregious case. And what makes it, I think, even more outrageous is that this is something ultimately where I think there was an element of the government that wanted it to happen. I'm not saying it was entirely orchestrated. Obviously, there was a rally, people got out of control, but they knew it was going to get out of control. And it's almost like strategically, they were like, listen, guys, you know what? Let's let some of these guys in here because that's when the trap will be sprung. I mean, remember, they did this in the Whitmer operation, and the same guy who ran that out of the FBI office in Detroit transferred to DC to basically supervise the investigations and prosecutions of it. So there's a connection that went on there. And so much these days of what happens with our police state institutions is they put on a facade.
Right, of course. There's so much artifice here. I mean, I think you're seeing this in the multiple show trials of Donald Trump, where, they're going to next indict him for putting too much mustard on his ham sandwich or something. And as is often the case, it's not, sometimes in the case of the Trump prosecutions, sometimes they've just kind of made it up. But in some of the prosecutions, they've caught him doing things that might, I guess, sort of technically be violations, but would never otherwise be prosecuted. The great example of this is he, as president, with the power to declassify documents at will without telling anybody, he had some documents stored after his presidency. He is indicted for this. Hillary Clinton, while Secretary of State with no ability to declassify documents at will, is improperly storing them on an unsecure server where they almost certainly were hacked by foreign powers. Donald Trump, they want to put in an orange jumpsuit. Hillary Clinton gets let off the hook by the FBI director, who even admits what she did was wrong. And you know this very well yourself because you were selectively prosecuted by the Obama administration for something that Democrats do every freaking day of the week. And they do it at a much larger scale, which is they give a little too much money to preferred political candidates. You did it at an extremely small scale, but only Dinesh D'Souza ever gets prosecuted for it.
When my case came up in 2013, I didn't see it as a prelude to any kind of police state. I thought, look, I have upset the vindictive narcissist in the White House, Obama. I made this movie. And so I should have known there's a big target on my back. I've been very foolish about this whole thing. I saw it as a one-off. I didn't see it as a precursor to what would happen to Carter Page, Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn, of course, now Trump. And yeah, you're absolutely right. If they went after Trump on one thing, hey, listen, you got this classified document. It's a nuclear secret. You shouldn't have taken it. We tried to get it back. You were pugnaciously refusing to give it to us. We could look at the facts. But when you have 90 plus charges and it's like, it's a shotgun, right? If we can't get him in DC, we'll get him in Georgia. Can't get him in Georgia, we'll get him in New York. And can't get him in New York on the criminal stuff. So let's destroy his business with the civil. So this is pure police state thuggery. There's no other way to look at it. And so this movie is, again, coming back to what we started with, not one that I would be happy about making. I'm a little dismayed that we are at this point where it needs to be made. We've adopted a pretty unusual strategy. We bought out hundreds of theaters, and we're showing the movie on 2 days, October 23rd and 25th. And we're selling tickets on our website, which is policestatefilm.net, the website you mentioned. And it's great to see it in the theater because I make these films for the theater. And this is a film that lends itself to cinematics. I mean, it's in that way, it's in a completely different category than 2000 Mules cinematically.
Well, and then it also, I noticed from the very early scenes of the movie, you happen to have a particularly well-known actor in the movie who, I think it was a few years ago, was in something like 3 or 4 of the Best Picture nominated films of the year at the Oscars. The great international film and television star, Nick Searcy. So you've really got a lot of the high Hollywood cinematography and filmmaking, and this really compelling story that we're all living every day.
It brings the police state sort of visually and emotionally home to people, because you and I could talk to them about it, but still the ordinary American is going to say something like, well, I'm not Trump, and I didn't go in the Capitol on January 6th, and I pay my taxes, so guess what? The FBI is never going to come smashing through my door. And this film is really aimed at convincing that guy, don't be so sure of that. We are in precarious territory. Now, we're not all the way there, because once the jaws of it snap shut, I can't make a movie like this. And in fact, when a police state is fully established, the only thing you can do is run. I mean, that's really the message of refugees from North Korea or even Solzhenitsyn's Gulag. At that point, you have to try to get out, get your family out, get your money out. It's the only thing you can do. We don't want to get to that point. And I think, fortunately, we have time and we have room to be able to block and roll back this police state. And that's the urgency of the message of this film.
So the dates are October 23rd and 25th, but people need to go get their tickets now, whether you want to see it in theaters, whether you want to see it digitally. Go right now to policestatefilm.net and get your tickets before they sell out. Dinesh, thank you for coming on. Best of luck in the rest of the media tour. And I look, I've got the screener. I hate to brag to the listeners who I'm sure want to go see the movie now. I've got the screener so I can watch it on my phone or computer, but I'm sure it's going to look a lot cooler in the theater.
Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic.
Chief Division Counsel and DOJ have approved a no-knock breach. We want the subject to be on display, doing the walk of shame, full visual impact. Any questions?
Are we becoming a police state?
Government told American citizens they couldn't go to church on Sunday.
I've never seen anything like it. It may be the Russia other people grew up in, but not my America.
FBI warrant, come to the door now!
There's a heavy banging at my door. Open up! There's 15 marked units on my property. I got SWAT in the back of my house.
They took a battering ram to my door.
6 a.m. I hear boom, 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 and hear about 6 to 8 military-style soldiers, with the tallest one of them pointing an automatic rifle at my head.
FBI, we have an arrest warrant!
Shock you out of sleep, drag you out of your house half clothed, refuse to give you a warrant, ransack your house.
Now I'm facing 15 years in federal prison
for doing nothing other than exercising my right to free speech.
I had no reason to be attacked.
I hope that you remember Matt's name and the role you played in killing him.
How did we give the state this kind of power?
9/11 changed everything.
We're going to expand the Bureau from law enforcement to domestic intelligence. Legal shackles are now off.
It used to be Islamic terrorism. That threat has kind of dissipated.
Our focus is shifting.
They're moving to domestic extremism. It really paints anybody who's right of center.
What we need is a person to look at. And then we go find out what crime you did.
If you're a pro-life, pro-family Catholic, they define you as radical.
The demand for domestic terrorism vastly outstrips the supply.
When candidate Trump came down the escalators, the government had a meltdown.
We are going to drain the swamp.
We'll see about that.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you.
The Patriot Act and FISA were used against Donald Trump.
Google literally rewrote their news algorithm based upon what Trump was doing so that they could get this guy.
You just take out the word Russiagate and you put in COVID origins. You take out COVID origins and you put in Hunter Biden's laptop. You take that out and you put in January 6th. It's the replicated play from the deep state and their partners in the media.
They're not just deplatforming you. They are trying to throw people in prison.
If they're coming for me, they're coming for you.
Hands on your head! These are anti-government.
We have freedom of religion and freedom of speech!
Violent extremists, and they must be dealt with. We can do anything we want.
Police State. Exclusively in theaters October 23rd and 25th. Tickets sold only on policestatefilm.net.